there is a problem for many new marketeers to understand why and how they should apply the 60-40 rule.
Well, the first thing is, I think it is a useful way to think about your marketing activities, to divide them into, on the one hand, long-term activities associated with brand building and short-term activities associated with what we call activation. So the long-term brand building stuff is about building up mental availability, about creating memory structures that will hopefully affect your brand preference, not just now, but for some time to come. And then on the other hand, the short-term stuff is about harvesting that stuff. It's about making sure that those memory structures then are used and trigger behavior in the short term and actually make people buy things now, make people choose your brand rather than someone else's now. And I think you need to do both those things. To do marketing efficiently, it works best if you do the kind of the charming and you do the selling. You do the long term and the short term. You have those things working together. People are much more likely to choose your brand if you've warmed them up first. But you also need to do the stuff that converts. Some activities are better at one job and some activities are good at the other job. So, conventional brand advertising is good at making people feel warm towards the brand, but some of it's not so good at generating immediate leads. Paid search is extremely good at converting people at the point of purchase and so on. So I think you do need both those things. It is perfectly possible to sell a product just by doing short-term selling and not do any of the brand stuff. But for most brands, that's not very efficient. It is perfectly possible to just do all the gorgeous brand stuff and then put your product on the shelf. But actually, you can make things work a bit harder if you do some other things like promotions and, direct marketing and so on as well. You need both. I think for any given brand at any given time, in any given category, at any given situation, there will be an optimum balance. What should that optimum balance be? Now, this is, I think, an area of controversy. So some people have taken our 60-40 rule as being an iron law that it should always be 60% brand and 40% activation, and that's not what we say. To be honest, I can't even remember where the idea of a 60-40 rule came from, whether it was us or other people saying that. I mean, we certainly, in the long and the short of it, said that we thought for the brands that we had looked at, that the optimum mix seems to be about 60% brand and 40% activation, with some variation, quite significant level of variation, for the kinds of brands which we were looking at, which are basically, because of the sample that we look at, they are quite decent brands. They're proper professional marketing type brands. They're not corner shops. They're brands that, probably are at the level where they can afford to hire an advertising agency. Mm-hmm. So given all those caveats, we think it's about 60-40 for an average brand that has, that is at that level. But what we also said is that the mix will vary by category, by brand size, by budget level, by pricing, and many other factors. And we wrote a whole book called Effectiveness in Context about how it's not a fixed ratio and how it varies. So we've not advocated a fixed ratio. Some people seem to think we do.
They haven't read the Effectiveness
They haven't read. Yeah, well, one of the problems is that the book, The Long and the Short of it, is relatively famous in the very small world we live in. And a lot of people haven't read Effectiveness in Context because it's our most recent analysis of the general data, and it maybe hasn't reached many people yet. So I'd urge
It needs a higher
I'd
share of
urge the
search.
audience to read Effectiveness in Context. Read the book. Yeah, it's not a fixed ratio. And what we offer some rules of thumb in that book for how you might kind of roughly estimate where your ratio might be as a starting point. But what I've always tried to stress when I talk to real brands, in the real world, is, okay, well, maybe for a brand like you, it should be 70-30 or 50-50 or something like that. That might be your starting point. Now go out and measure it properly. Okay, so there are ways you might consider measuring it properly. The one I'm most comfortable with is econometric modeling. I would say that because I'm an econometrician by training, but increasingly what we're seeing is econometric models, market mix models, as people often call them, are able to give you a read on the optimum brand activation ratio, and tell you what it is for your brand at your budget level and price level and so on. So two that I've worked with recently, and we've done that. I didn't do the analysis. Independent econometricians worked out the shape of that curve, the 60-40 curve. One, the optimum was exactly 60-40, which was really gratifying. The other one was 70-30, actually. So find your own mix. Another way of looking at it would be to do controlled experiments with different mixes in different parts of the country, say, or different markets. I suspect that there are a bunch of businesses where the optimum might be really skewed towards activation. I mean, what we notice, for example, within our data is that startups and new brands, launches, in the very, very early launch phase, actually, I can't remember what the ratio is, but the ratio is slightly in favor of activation, I think. And what happens is, as the brand matures and grows, it then tilts towards 60-40 and then goes slightly higher for market leaders. So it seems to us as if the optimum mix does vary with maturity and brand size. And I have a strong suspicion that if you're starting a little business, maybe activation is the way to go. And then what you do is, as you get bigger and you get more budget and you reach more people and expand, you then get to the point where you need to then begin to do brand advertising. With my wife and her own little consultancy business, my advice to her would be focus on paid search. Do that first. Yeah. If you're a local minicab company or a pizza delivery company, you're going to start by putting leaflets through people's doors. You're not going to start with, a 30-second TV ad. So,
would you say that there is a connection here between the CMO and the CFO?
Yes.
That they have actually here a common interest.
Yes.
For the investors, they want the share of their profit earnings.
Yes.
Would be the way to start this discussion in the boardroom.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, you're bang on. Yeah. I have written some presentations and given some presentations with exactly that idea in mind. The idea that marketing communications are about your cash flow. And that, if you like, activation gives you short-term cash flow advantages, and brand building gives you long-term cash flow advantages. It gives you a sort of sustainable base level of cash flow that you wouldn't otherwise have. I mean, the problem I have with this is that I don't get many opportunities to speak to CFOs. I mean, it's an internal communication thing, really, because I think if we could help CMOs to make that argument to CFOs, then the whole thing would be a lot better. I can provide CMOs with ammunition. That to a large extent, it's a big part of what I've been doing for most of my career, really. Somebody at the IPA said something about, you work for a creative agency, but actually, really, you talk much more like someone like an accountant or someone who works in a media agency. And really, a lot of what I'm talking about is, okay, advertising is an investment. You spend money here on media here, and you get a cash flow over this time period. And this is what the net present value of that cash flow is when you use discounted cash flow analysis and your contribution to shareholder value. And that's really what I spent most of my career talking about. Early on in that question, you talked about B2B, and I do think there's quite a lot of potential there. Peter and I wrote a short report on doing a special analysis of the IPA data and how it applies to B2B brands. Our book, Effectiveness in Context, is not widely read. Perhaps our short report on B2B is almost unknown, probably. There's some guys at LinkedIn who are doing some very good work on
John Bardo and
Peter Weinwell. Yes, John and Peter. They're the Les and Peter of B2B. They're particularly interested in using B2B advertising for brand purposes, and they're gathering together an interesting body of research and analysis and think pieces on how B2B advertising works, of which our little report is what was their first.
Together with the Ehrenberg Bass
Indeed,
findings and
indeed, yeah, exactly. So our little report suggested that some of the basic rules for B2B advertising are not that different from the rules for B2C. Share of voice still matters. Emotional advertising is still powerful. The 60-40 rule is slightly different for B2B, but not very different. I can't remember what the ratio is, but it's a little bit more activation heavy than the typical B2C brand. But so much of what we see in B2C seems to apply to B2B. So that's the kind of theory, and I would really welcome more research in that area, because B2B is becoming more and more important in the advertising industry and in the marketing industry and in economies around the world. Experience of running my own B2B business tells me about how brand building works in B2B, and I know it works. But you don't see me spending large amounts of money on TV ads or posters or taking out press ads or any of those things. So I do brand building, but I do it through things like this interview, or social media, or publishing reports, or speaking at conferences, or whatever. So I think all businesses need to do some brand building, but that doesn't mean that they are going to be using paid advertising. And so that's something that we've really wanted to stress in our research, is when we talk about brand building, we are not necessarily talking just about conventional media advertising. And if you go back to LinkedIn, I think LinkedIn are in quite an interesting position in terms of being able to see how B2B marketing works. This is why John and Peter are kind of, I think, quite interesting guys, because they're funny guys. I really like them. Yeah, I kind of regard them as friends. So, I hope they do too. But I want to
taking up your time.
I want to take issue with something you just said, which is about trust, because actually I think trust is important, but it's not a massive issue in marketing communications. We actually looked at that within our data set, and we found that trust is, I think, of all the brand metrics that we looked at for correlation with sales, it's the least important. The sort of thing that's going on in marketing communications is more about creating a sense of kind of like, this is a brand which is, I feel, attracted to. That a brand that, first of all, that you think of at all, mental availability, and that you are attracted to in some sense. I think it's going to be good. I think I kind of like it. But the whole issue of trust really only kind of comes when you've actually had direct experience with it. So, so I don't expect people to, like they might see me on stage, or they might see me in this video or something like that, and they might think, okay, well, he's an interesting guy. I might want to read his research. I'm not thinking that they're going to automatically trust me in some sense, just on the basis of that little contact. They're only going to trust the research that Peter and I have done once they've read it closely and maybe looked at the technical appendices with the sample sizes and stuff like that. You see, I mean, you don't get that. I don't think you get trust out of advertising much.